Hi everyone. Can my team confirm me that the audio and video is correct, please? Perfect. Okay, so well, first of all, thank you so much for joining my session. If you don't know me, my name is Alba Rivas. I am a developer advocate at Salesforce. And today I'm going to talk about how you can use the newest Ecmascript features in Lightning Web Components. Let me go to the next slide. So here you have my contact details in case that you have any questions later. But at the end of the session, I'm going to have some time for Q&A. So you can ask questions on the chat window and I will take a look at them later. This is the forward-looking statement slide, our favorite slide, which just means that Salesforce, as we are a publicly traded company, it means that you should make purchases based on the functionality that is currently available. But no worries, because everything that we are going to talk about today is standard JavaScript, so it doesn't apply much. As a reminder, this is the second episode of a webinar series. I already did the first episode in which I explained everything about Ecmascript and JavaScript terminology. I also explained everything about the concepts of transpilation and polyfills and how we apply those concepts in Lightning Web Components compilation and Lightning Web Components runtime execution to make available some features from Ecmascript 6 to Ecmascript 8, for older browsers. And I also explained that despite though we don't apply transpilation and polyfills for Ecmascript features in versions 9, 10, 11, and 12, you can use them. You can use them as long as your browser supports them and as long as Logger service supports them. So in this webinar and the third webinar that will take place on the 1st of April, I'm going through some of the most interesting features from these Ecmascript versions here from 9 to 12 that you can use in Lightning Web Components as of today. So bear with me. If you want to watch the recording, here you have the link for the first webinar. And with that, let's start with this one, with this episode, right? So this is a summary table with the features that we are going to take a look at in this episode and the third episode. In this episode, I'm going to focus on features from Ecmascript 9 and features from Ecmascript 10, right? These are the features that we are going to take a look today. And I believe that the best way to learn and also to explain something is by example. So what I did is to build an application, a Lightning Web Components applications that you can clone, you can deploy to your organization that contains examples for all the features that we are going to see in this webinar series from Ecmascript 9 to Ecmascript 12. And I also created an application in Lightning Web Components OSS, using Lightning Web Components OSS, because I wanted to demonstrate how you can use these features outside of the platform with Lightning Web Components, and also because there are a couple more features that you can use because outside of the platform, Logger service does not apply, and we can use a couple more APIs. Great. So perfect. I was just checking that everything is correct, and it seems it is, so I'm super glad. Let's start talking about asynchronous looping, right? In Ecmascript 9, there is a feature called for await of, which is used for performing asynchronous iterations. This is probably the most complex feature I'm going to talk about today, so bear with me if you don't get it, you don't understand it, because your knowledge of JavaScript is not too wide. Don't worry, because the rest of the features, I promise, they are going to be much more straightforward, but this one It's a bit more complex because it implies talking about asynchronous code, asynchronous iterators, and generators, right? The best way to explain it with an example. So imagine that you have an API endpoint that you want to query, right? This API endpoint here. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to query the endpoint here. So basically this endpoint is an endpoint from the GitHub API, and it is returning all the commits that have been done in our fantastic LWC recipes repo. What's the deal with this API endpoint? That it, as the number of commits may be very high, the commits are returned in a paginated way. And if we take a look at the network execution, I'm going to execute it again so that we can take a look at the response. This is the response that we received from the GitHub server. And here we can find a header, a link header, in which the GitHub server is telling us the next URL that we need to execute to retrieve the next chunk of commits, right? So ideally, from JavaScript, we would like to perform a series of sequential requests to this API asynchronously. There is an interdependency among those requests because we need to wait for the response to get the URL of the following API. And this is a typical use case for which you will want to use an asynchronous generator or an asynchronous iterator, and then iterate to perform those requests one by one using a for await loop. If you are familiar with the for of loop, is exactly the same, but the difference here is that we are going to wait every individual response, right? And here I'm using a generator for that. Generators are not part of Ecmascript 9. They are from a previous version. What's part of Ecmascript 9 is the for await of loop syntax, right? So just so that is clear what the example is doing, what we are doing here in this generator is to define the URL to which we want to perform the first request. And then we are going to execute a while loop, right? In which we are going to fetch that URL that is going to return us those first 30 commits with the next URL on the link header. We are going to await the response and retrieve the next URL from the header, and then we are going to yield every individual commit that comes into the response. So this is a typical use case in which you will want to use for await to be able to await all those asynchronous operations one after the other. Hope that it made sense. I know that some people have confusion between when to use for await of and when to use promise.all, and I'm not going to explain that in the webinar, but if you clone the repo, I added a couple of examples that are in the code, are commented out in the code of this recipe here, and you're going to be able to see the difference of the different use cases in which you will apply one solution or the other, right? Great. So the next, and I forgot something super important, to execute the sample function. So for these recipes, this app that I have created, the way in which I have done it is that I have the example here, and when you click on the execute sample function button, then the code executes. And normally the code is going to log something into the console. And we can see here that all the commits for LWC recipe, it's really the commit author, right, is what we are logging here thanks to the usage of for await of. Amazing, super useful. So the next feature I want to talk about today, it also belongs to Ecmascript 9, and these are object REST properties. And before talking about object REST properties, is much easier if, let me open 1 second something that I have here so I can copy the code. So it's much easier to talk first about destructuring assignment, which is kind of the same concept, but it was released in Ecmascript 6. It belongs to Ecmascript 6 version, and it applies to arrays. So let's say that I have this code here. I have 3 different variables, and what I'm doing is to assign the values of an array to these 3 different variables. But what happens here is that the array has 4 values. So what we can do with the structuring assignment is to prepend the 3 dot operator to a variable to indicate that we want that variable to consume or to be assigned all the remaining individual properties that are not captured by the other variables in the array, right? So here, for instance, the result is that our REST variable is going to contain the API and Blaze mascots, right? So if we take a look at the concept for objects, it's kind of the same. So what we can do with object REST properties is that we can define a variable that is going to get assigned the remaining properties that don't get assigned to the other variables in my object definition. So here in this example, we have an object which is Astro. Astro has name, age, and hobby. And we are defining a property called hobby. So hobby is going to be assigned to this property, but then we have 2 remaining properties. So what we can do is to use the 3 dot operator and have those 2 remaining properties assigned to the new Astro variable. So if I execute this sample function, we are going to see that this is exactly what we were expecting. We were able to capture those values thanks to the REST properties notation. And this is something that we transform in the code so that it works in compatibility browsers. So you can be safe about this feature and also about this one. So for object REST properties, spread properties is also something very similar, but this time the 3 dot operator is something that we are going to use in the right hand side of the assignment. Again, we're going to take a look at an example for arrays, because for arrays we had spread syntax available from Ecmascript 6, and you may be already familiar with this. So let's say that we have a constant which is Astro, we have another one which is Cody, and we have an array which contains 2 values, API and Blaze. So what we can do with the spread operator is to say that I want to effectively spread those that array into individual items on the array. If we log the resulting array here, we are going to have Astro from mascot A, Cody from mascot B, and then we are going to have API and Blaze from this spread array here. So for objects is kind of the same. Let's say that we have an Astro object in which we have name and age, right? And what we want to do is to spread or expand our Astro properties in the creation of this new object. So if here I execute the sample function, we're going to see that effectively that is what has happened. Our new Astro object contains hobby, and also the spread properties from name and age. Very useful. I'm sure that this is going to save you a couple of lines of code many times. Great. And the last function I want to, or the last feature I want to take a look at from Ecmascript 9 is a function that you can use in your promises, which is promise.prototype.finally. It works exactly the same as the finally that you use in synchronous code in the try-catch block. It contains something that is going to be executed in any case if the promise is fulfilled, but also if the promise is rejected, with the difference that we are working with asynchronous code. That means that what we are passing here to the finally method is really a callback that will execute in the future once the promise fulfills or rejects, and this method indeed returns a promise. So in this example, I think I'm going to make it a bit bigger. Yeah. So in this example, we have a promise that always resolves, right? So this promise first is going to execute the then block, and finally, it will always execute the finally block. And what happens if we have a promise that rejects? Well, a promise that rejects will execute the catch block, and then it will execute the finally block. The finally block is something that will always be executed asynchronously after the execution of the then or catch blocks. So let's take a look at this example again. I'm going to execute the sample function, and here we have the result. So first, the first promise executed, and we went into the then block. Salesforce mascots are super fun. Then, because of the order in which promises are executed, the second promise catch block executed, which is this one here, but this is just because of the fact that I'm using two promises in the same function, not for any other reason. And then we get the two finally methods executed. Yes, definitely are, and I hope these examples help you. Great. So now let's go to the Ecmascript 10 tab. And this one contains a couple more features, but they are much simpler, I believe, because, for instance, this first one is super simple. So this just means that before Ecmascript 10, it was compulsory to use, to indicate an error here on the catch block. You had to compulsorily indicate that error, and now that is something that you can omit. And if we take a look at the code before Ecmascript 10, this code would throw an exception. And now, sorry, let's clean this up. Yeah. And now it's just logging the error. This is not an exception, an unhandled exception, right? Then we have a second feature, which is array prototype.flat. Again, super simple, because what we do with flat is that if you have an array with subarrays, we are able to use this method to flat the array and with its subarrays. If you don't indicate a parameter, you are going to flat it to any level of depth. But you have also the option to indicate a parameter, which means that you only want to do the flattening until one level of depth, in this case, or the number that you indicate in the parameter. So for this second example, we have an array with subarrays in two different levels of depth. And if we execute the flat method, the output is going to flatten just it by one. And this is the result that we obtain. Then we have array.prototype.flatmap. This method is identical to executing first a map function and second a flat function with a depth of 1. but it's slightly more efficient and it's also going to save you some lines of code. So I recommend you to execute this one. What we're going to do is to first execute the example with the two functions, using the two functions separately. So let's say that I want to, okay, let me refresh the page because I have a variable already declared from a previous example execution. Okay, so let's say that I have this array here and I want to apply a map function. This map function is going to return an array for each individual item, and the array is going to contain the value and then the value to uppercase. This is what we are seeing here in the output, right? And if we then flat the result, we are going to obtain a single array with the values of the subarrays flattened, right? So this is exactly the same result that we are going to obtain if we just apply the Flatmap function, as you can see here, right? Very useful as well. Great. Then we have another function which is very interesting to create objects. Object.fromEntries. FromEntries is going to allow you to define an object from a key value pairs of properties, right? For instance, if you have a multi-dimensional array, or if you have a map in which you have indicated a list of key value pairs, like here, name Astro, age 5, hobbies, dancing and hiking, then you can do object from entries, and this is going to allow you creating an object for the properties that we specified as keys in our map, right? This is going to work in the next way. Let me execute the function. And here we can see the result that effectively we are receiving an object for which the properties are the keys that we indicated in our map. It can be very convenient as well. We also have some methods for trimming a string, which means removing some spaces from the beginning or from the ending of the string. And again, here we have a couple of examples that I'm going to execute. So let's say that we want to remove the blank spaces from the beginning, the blank characters from the beginning. We can do greeting.trim star, and as you can see here, the spaces that we have at the beginning are going to be removed. And if we want to do the same but with the end, we are able to do that also doing trim end, as we can realize here. Very easy. And the last feature I want to talk about today is the ability to take a look at the description of a symbol. Symbols are from Ecmascript 6. It's not something new, right? And this is something that was new for me, so I'm going to explain more or less where a symbol is. So basically, a symbol is a kind of primitive for which it is guaranteed that every time that you construct a symbol, the values, the object that get created are going to be different from any other symbols that have been created before. This is normally used for defining private properties, hidden metadata, constants, and things like that. And I'm going to show you, for instance, how you could use it to create a kind of private property for an object, right? So here, for instance, I have defined a name, which is a symbol, and you can use that symbol as the key for a property from an object, right? Using the square brackets. With the square brackets, you are telling here the JavaScript engine that you want to define a property that is defined from this symbol. So what happens here is that as every time that you instantiate a new symbol, the value is going to be different. This is going to make the property kind of private, because only in the place in which you have defined the symbol, you are going to be able to access that property. And you can access that property by doing this, using the square brackets as well, right? So what's new in Ecmascript 10 is that before you were able to pass a description to the symbol, but there was no way to retrieve that description. And now you are going to be able to retrieve that description. That sometimes can be very useful, because as you can see here, I don't have much information that identifies which symbol I created. So now, from now on, you are going to be able to use the description field on the symbol primitive. And if I execute the function, you can see here that the description has been printed to the console. Great. So that's all for today. Let me go back to my presentation, because I want to share here the 2 repos for the 2 apps that I created, right? One of the apps is for Lightning Web Components and on the platform, and the other app is for Lightning Web Components outside of the platform. I also leave you here a link to a Trailhead module. Well, I think it's really a set of modules about modern JavaScript. If you are not familiar with some of the features I have mentioned from Ecmascript 6, take a look at this module, because you are going to learn a lot. And this is especially interesting for people who come from Apex like me. It was super helpful to learn doing this module, right? And before going into the Q&A, I want to remind you the different channels in which you can connect with us, right? We have our handler in Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and we are on YouTube, where you are watching the video right now. So what I recommend you to do is to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so that you receive notifications. Great. So thank you so much for watching. I'm going to take a look at the comments now. Okay. So here we have Julian. Thank you. Orlando, sorry, I don't know when you joined, so I'm not sure what you missed, but this video is recorded and you can watch it later, and you can always reach out to me. Okay, I have a question from Orlando. Is the ESXX feature a package we can get access to? So this is exactly this. I'm going to copy the repo URL into the chat window. There you have the Lightning Web Components application, and you have another one for the Lightning Web Components OSS application. So you can clone both and take a look at the different examples. There is another question. Okay. How many of the users use Ecmascript 21 features? Well, this is something that you can start using as of today, as long as your browsers support them. If the browser that you are using is a modern browser, which is often the case because Ecmascript 20 features, for instance, are supported in Chrome, in the Chromium version of Edge, and in Firefox, everywhere, right? But I always recommend you to test it. That is something, so if you are able to use modern features, that is going to make you much more productive, is going to save you lines of code, is going to save you time, and it's also really important that at least you understand them, because other developers may be using them, and sometimes JavaScript is a kind of difficult to understand because there are many great features that you can use to make your code shorter, and it's important to have all these features in mind as well, not only so that you can use them but also to be able to understand others' code. And that's something that you can use as of today in Lightning Web Components as long as the browser supports them. I don't know about the number of users that are using, the developers that are using these features, because I don't know, but I'm sure that the most advanced developers are doing that. I think we are on time. There are no more questions, but if you have okay, there is a last question about Santi Shiri, which is, current browsers. Yeah, so current browsers, most of them support Ecmascript features. If you look in Google for Ecmascript feature support in current browsers, or if you go to every individual features in MDM, in the Mozilla Developer Network documentation page, you are going to see that most of the features I talked about today are supported in most of the browsers. The only browsers that don't support them are older versions and, for instance, Internet Explorer. But we are not supporting Internet Explorer anymore in Lightning Experience. Okay. Okay, so I think that we need to leave because it's 3:31. So thank you so much, and I will be on Twitter if you need something else. Thank you. Bye bye.